Hello, and this is from Baltic Real Estate Forum, and Markus Schaefer just had the presentation here on stage. Markus Schaefer is a founding partner at Hosoya Schaefer Architects, and he's also planning and doing a project here in Riga. And so we're glad to see you, and happy that you came here for this small conversation.
No, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. And you were sharing your presentation about all those industrious developments and ideas you brought, and you explained what's happening in Switzerland. And what would be the core things for city planners and developments to take into account in planning city today?
Well, I think the main point we're trying to make in our book is twofold. On the one hand, we see that industry is actually coming back to the city, because it likes closeness to knowledge workers, closeness to knowledge and talent, close to the universities. It also likes closeness to urban markets, people who can spend money on manufactured goods which are done in cities and so on. So this is one thing, industry is coming back. It's an industry which is more decentralized, it's smaller, it has a smaller emission footprint, it is more human scale and therefore able to actually exist in the city. On the other hand, what we also see is that the time of globalization, as we experienced it in the last 25 years, is maybe changing. The world is maybe disconnecting to some degree. And it is important that also in such a world, we still have access to goods, access to commodities, access to technology, because we need that technology in order to feed and clothe the people who live in cities, right? So for both of these reasons, we think that industry and urban production and urban manufacturing in this future we are going towards needs a place in the city.
Yeah, well, that's quite an interesting angle, because let's say in the last 5, 10 or 15 years we have heard more stories about how to make city more human and how to humanize city and make it more accessible for persons living there. And the industry part hasn't been taken into account so much. And also, if we are thinking and reflecting back on some 10 or 15 years in the past, we see that there have been many initiatives in order to put industry outside the city. So this is totally a new paradigm shift, as you also mentioned that in your presentation.
Well, again, industry had to leave the city because it was loud, it consumed a lot of space, and in other places in the world you could produce more cheaply. And perfected, digitalized logistical supply chains allowed that actually to happen. So you could produce from a Swiss perspective, you could produce in Poland or in China and import half-manufactured goods to Switzerland and so on, so that was possible. But the industry coming back is actually a different type of industry. It is really digitalized, emission-free or emission-poor. It is decentralized, it is knowledge-heavy, it's highly automated, so it's possible to bring the industry back, right? And a lot of the development work in the last 25 years was, of course, reusing brownfield sites and putting mixed-use developments onto it. And we now see, specifically in Switzerland, that maybe we did a bit too much of that. Too much of urban production has been lost, because never forget that cities need diversified urban economies. So it's important to have different kinds of jobs in the city, different kinds of jobs which also makes the city resilient on the one hand. And on the other hand, of course, people living in the city, they also need to do something, right? They need to be able to work and maybe not only work in highly abstract jobs, consulting, banking, etc., but maybe also work in things which are applied, which are tangible, which are haptic, which are productive, right? And I envision a city like that to be a very good place, a collaborative place. So not only industrial, right? Not only technical, but also industrious. So productive, collaborative, cooperative, with a good shared narrative and story.
Yeah, we see that in this past years, also due to this industrial plant and placing outside the city, we have created this quite a challenging situation in mobility and and so that means that this moving those less noisy and those nature environment friendly in places back in city also will change mobility as well.
Absolutely, that's the idea. I think very much cities and city developments are driven by infrastructure. So form follows infrastructure. So The cities of the pedestrians brought us the medieval cities, which we all enjoy, right? The cities of the trams brought us the Gründerzeit cities, which were expanding out. The cities of the car is, of course, the city which is suburbanizing, you know, where people travel a lot. And that's not a very sustainable city. And it's not a very comfortable city because cars are just consuming too much space, right? And therefore, the idea to think the city again, as it always was in the past, up to modern times, as something which is of mixed use, which is diverse, which is about ideas, but also about production, which is about living, but also about work. To think a city again like that, I think is a really great idea, and it's also a sustainable and resilient idea.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that the good way how to plan city today in those new environments would be not making separate silos of different areas in city, but to include all the ways and all the sorts of buildings and all the sorts of ways.
Yeah, because then you have a city of short connections, right? The 5-minute city or the 15-minute city, which everybody's talking about. You have a city which is full of interactions. And you have a city which is also economically viable, and a city which is attractive for people to live in, right? And in the end, this is what we want, right? We want cities which are productive in terms of goods and in terms of ideas. Cities also where young families would like to come because they, on the one hand, have good urban space here, and on the other hand, they have also a way of making their living in an environment like that.
Yeah, that's a keyword you mentioned, that good urban space of living is something that we also can see in your plans and in your development of Riga port city. Is it?
Yeah, so basically in our office we're always trying to think about the city in a kind of a fractal way, as a kind of a way of nesting spaces into each other. You know, for example, you have an urban block with a nice green courtyard. The block is connected to other blocks which generate a small neighborhood. The neighborhood is connected into a quarter. The quarters are connected together by good infrastructure and good public transport with each other, and maybe to a city center which has other qualities and so on. So to generate this connective tissue is very much the aim of a good urban plan, because cities are all about interaction, right? So now we are interacting, we are exchanging thoughts, we're exchanging ideas, we're drinking a coffee together. This is valuable, right? Something happens while we're interacting. Cities are made for that. They're incubators for this type of interaction. And in order to be good incubators, they have to be organized to make meaningful, stable, safe, socially relevant, mixed interactions. And in the case of the port city, what we're trying to do is actually not one large development which is following one idea, which is monothematic, but we're trying to do something which consists again in itself of neighborhoods. You know, innovation, the export basin, the Soho area, the courtyard area, which is on the one hand a diversified offer for people to come and live and work in an area like that. It's also a diversified offer for development, for investment, because it's not monofunctional, it's not a cluster risk, right? But it's something which is organic. And to generate something which is organic, which is vital and tied together by good infrastructure and by good open spaces, by good green spaces, which are walkable and attractive, is very much what we're striving to do in our urban designs. And I think in the Port City master plan, we very much like to try that too. Additionally, what is amazing about the port cities, of course, that you have access to the Daugava River, you have access to water. I mean, it's just amazingly beautiful, right? And you have access to scale. Imagine that you step out of the medieval and the Art Nouveau Riga city center, and you enter in a new environment which is still human scale, but all of a sudden gives you access to this gigantic scale of the port, the big silo buildings, the terminals, the big cruise ships and so on. And that's exciting. It's an exciting vision. It's an exciting place to be.
There also, sometimes we have thought that it's quite challenging to create those green spaces, those places for socializing in city, if a city as Riga is so far to the northern side. now with the long autumns, with the long winters.
Well, yes, but as we all know, that might change, with climate change. I mentioned in my lecture the promise of the North, a new global North which could emerge, simply because the quality of life will shift northwards. You still will not have so much light. The light is still a problem. You have long winters, of course, right? But on the other hand, it might get warmer. You might have more exchange also between the countries around the Baltic Sea. You have maybe a bigger Baltic identity developing among the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. You might get closer to the European Union, So I think there's a lot to dream for and hope for in a situation like that. And the hope is always that when times are a bit more difficult, then maybe people wake up and realize they need to cooperate a bit more closely together, right? So we're coming out of a time in the West which was plentiful, which was globalized, everything seemed possible, mobility was abundant and so on. Now we are entering a time which is a bit more tricky, right? But that could always be an opportunity to generate new stories, to generate new ideas, and a new sense of cooperation, closeness, which could make a place like Riga strong.
Yeah, you mentioned also cooperation several times. Is it also that your ideas and the ways how your the city planning might be also used in other areas, not also in Riga, not only in Riga port city, but also you showed in your presentation that there are quite many unused spaces around the city center. And if I understand you correctly, your suggestion might be to use similar approach.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the big problem Riga has is that it's actually a very beautiful center. It has an amazingly beautiful center. It has access to the river. It has the Art Nouveau area and so on. So it's actually a really attractive space, but it's a space which is not used well yet, right? We have the exodus of people who leave the city. Every year the city still now is losing people, moving out into the suburbs or moving to other countries. And I think an important thing is to make sure that the city becomes just a more and an increasingly attractive place to be. Affordable, green, rid of cars, improved infrastructure, improved public transport, step by step, maybe with many small interventions, right? With small initiatives, with maybe Airbnb hotels in the Art Nouveau Center, or subsidized housing in the Old Town, or just very clever public-private partnerships to solve the center area. And then there's this ring around the center, which is actually fairly unused right now, which is still part of the city land, but which is not so dense, right? Before then the actual suburbs start, and to look at that area a bit more precisely and to see development opportunities. On the one hand, looking at this kind of the post-Soviet areas with the micro rayons and so on, which you could maybe in a very subtle way improve a bit and all of a sudden make it attractive again, right? Or use areas which are not used right now to make clever new housing for young people and so on. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and it's still almost walking distance to the city center, or biking distance at least to the city center. And all of these ideas, by the way, are developed by two institutions in the city, by Certus, a think tank, and by Ether, a young architecture office who just won the Latvian Architecture of the Year award a couple of days ago. And I think to work with these ideas in a kind of a PPP, public-private partnership way, with clever policies, clever investment vehicles, maybe also new ones, new investment vehicles. For example, in Switzerland, corporations are very important. Cooperations, so not corporations, but cooperations, meaning that private people pool their money, buy land and build a building together and then own it together. Things like that could be models which could really point towards an interesting urban future.
Yeah. Yeah, usually when like a private person is thinking about building a home or some other construction, then we are looking at our today's needs and trying to represent those needs in that building now. But you are speaking, this is actually about a different way to forecast what future might look like and try to shape the future of society, of the citizenship, of the communes in order to feel that angle and to understand how it might go that way.
Exactly. So there's a strategic level, there's a policy level, there is a development level, but there's also a very simple human idea of trying to be closer together. Just share, be closer together. Also share capital in the sense of making a building possible you wouldn't be able to do on your own, right? So in Switzerland, this is extremely strong, in Zurich especially, this system of cooperations. They have very interesting programming ideas, very fancy buildings actually, which have large rooms they share, offices they share, even cluster apartments where they share parts of the apartments and have individual cells attached to the apartment, all built by collective money with a bit of subsidies by the city for the land, so the land is a bit cheaper than it normally would be. And the interesting thing is with that you can also withdraw certain pieces of land from speculation and make sure it is stewarded well over a longer period of time. So that the slogan they have is that is something like happily share instead of not consuming lonely, Gemeinsam genießen statt einsam verzichten in German. And I think it's a really good slogan for a future which is a bit unpredictable right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having this conversation, Markus. And
pleasure. Yeah. And thanks for the invitation, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And, just several minutes ago, there was this BREL awards given also for the best project of the year. And so let's hope that Riga Port City, when it will be finished, also might receive this award here.
Well, I think maybe a very important last thing. The port city will never be finished. But planning together and thinking together about the possible future, that's the most important thing about master planning. Right? The goal is not the project. The goal is the human connections and the connections to a place that generates. Right? That's the key achievement. The key achievement is the collective, and the plan is the tool to generate the collective. And of course also buildings and so on. But that's maybe the second aim.
Okay. Well, thank you very much once again. Yeah.
Pleasure.
This was Markus Schaefer, a founding partner in Hosoya Schaefer Architects.